right now. So as of now, we are recording this presentation. We're going to post this over in the group too. And by the end of the night, the idea is we are going to have the ultimate thread of resources to introduce people to permaculture and get them started permaculture adventure. Does that sound good?
Yep.
All right. So my goals tonight as a kind of facilitator and a group leader of the project to create a great permaculture introduction is one, to inspire you. And also I'm a little bit choppy here. I'm still admitting people to the group as they come on. So you know, forgive me if I'm paying a little bit of attention to that too. So my goal here tonight is one, to inspire you, to give you some of that internal energy to pursue permaculture and to really start off on an adventure on this. So hopefully I will be able to share some things with you, that you'll find very inspiring. Two, I want to inform you about some of the trends that are growing on in permaculture that are most inspiring to me at the moment. And I hope that you'll be thinking about some of your own and you'll share them with the group as we go over in that other thread or in the chat here. If you've seen a recent permaculture video or you have a link to a page or a project that's really inspiring to you, please share it with us tonight. Three, I want to set you on an adventure with permaculture. I'll say I've been more or less on this for 20 years on permaculture particularly. I grew up in a hobby farming kind of situation and around a lot of farmers when I was a kid. And from my perspective, what I could tell was it was a situation that really didn't work well for anyone. From what I could see, the farmers were not making a living doing what they were doing. It was hard, back-breaking work. If you don't know, farmers face a lot of problems financially and socially. And then the food ended up being, the system wasn't really working well for people in cities either. And it was causing a lot of ecological problems as well. You know, it was something I didn't think I would necessarily come back to. And I loved it. I loved the connection with nature, but I kind of wanted to escape that, actually. It wasn't until the Iraq War started in 2001 that I became really disillusioned with the world. And I first heard that term, permaculture, on a public radio show. And the description of it, basically some of the same kind of information we're going to be talking about tonight, just blew up in my mind. And I thought, you know, this is the most important work in the world today. And I'm still inspired by it 20 years later on this adventure. So I hope maybe to inspire you to use it in your life in the same way. And finally, I want to give you a few regenerative assets, which is something that we'll talk about later. So this is my way of saying I want to invest in you. But we'll talk about that more later. So moving on, yeah, the thread is in the Transformative Adventures group. You can see that there. And I will be able to pause now and then to check on that thread and to check on the chat in this group too. I already saw people posting some resources. That's really exciting to me. So let's get started with a little bit of a discussion here. Do please feel free to chime in with an answer or two, and do keep it brief for now, but give us your name and an answer to one of these questions here. And let me also encourage you, if you're in on this group right now, do go over to the Transformative Adventures group, use that thread or start your own thread to introduce yourself and your project. We're going to really try to catch and store energy in our social capital together over in that group. So, so do feel free to introduce yourself in that way also. So, what is permaculture? Now, there are a lot of different answers to this. So, does someone have an answer to that question they would like to share? And yes, please chime in.
I think it's about trying to make a sustainable culture that can be permanent and isn't going to destroy what it's based on.
Yeah,
I like Lawton's approach, where he says that it's a design science, but he also had a student in one of his sessions who came back and said, you know, what you've really done is you've built the wardrobe to hang everything in. And it's not, you know, it's not gardening techniques. It's not just social constructions. It's this cabinet you can put anything in and a way of working with it.
Sure, yeah, an organizing system perhaps. That's true, that's great. Anyone else have one they want to add? An integrated system. Oh, well, this is a very technical one. I like that. I got to go over to the chat here. An integrated system of design that can be applied to all human endeavor. I like that too. Creating a sustainable ecosystem. Well, just to give you a few more, some of the informal definitions. Yeah, I love Dennis's. Be fair, be the forest. I'll take that. I think that's a great one. So, you know, Bill Mollison often used very different types of definitions, of short definitions of permaculture, to introduce them to different people, which is just a really smart way of being a teacher and being an activist. And these were informal ways of introducing the concept to people. So some of them that he used was working with nature instead of against it, earth repair, and one of my favorites is revolution disguised as gardening. And then I think the best one that I think he ever gave, my friend PJ Shamil actually is the one who informed me of this, and I just love it. It's making a nice place to live. So permaculture is a way to make a nice place to live. I sure like that. So these are all some informal definitions of permaculture. And in the designer's manual, he also gives, this is from the designer's manual. He gives this visual definition of permaculture, which shows contemporary Western agriculture at the top, where we're tilling the soil and planting annuals. And then it shows transition to permaculture, where we're starting to move into perennial systems. And I see some hedgerows in here, maybe there's swales. And then he labels this slide a permaculture, with 70% of the cropland devoted to forage farming, wild designed ecosystems that produce food with very minimal maintenance. And they produce excess fertility that help feed the rest of the farm. So this was one of his original definitions, a visual definition of permaculture. And I kind of like that too. Going along with what Joseph said, a very formal definition of permaculture would be, it's a system of design that starts with 3 ethics: care for the earth, care for the people, and understanding and accepting natural limits, or setting limits to population consumption was one of the original ways it was put. David Holmgren, one of the co-creators of permaculture from Australia, simplified these to earth care, people care, fair share. And I always like that. I think it captures a lot of the same ideas, but it rolls off the tongue. So then the other thing about permaculture is sometimes I hear from people that it's just a set of ethics. And it also includes principles, which we'll talk about later. And these are principles to help us specifically with the task of design. And permaculture includes a lot of methods of design. And so it's also more than just the principles, but it actually does give us some very concrete methods for how to go about design. So, and we'll talk about introducing those just a little bit too. And finally, permaculture was inspired by something called the pattern language concept. You can find a book called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, an architect. And the idea is that we can design things. He wanted to create a DIY design system where people could pick patterns, set their goal, and then pick patterns to accomplish their goal. So you can think of pretty much every permaculture book as a form of a pattern language. They include design tips and components and principles and methods of design, and then sets of patterns that we can pick. Like Peter was saying, it's like a wardrobe. You pick the shirt you want out of it for the day. And it's the same thing. So all the permaculture books are basically like that. They're pattern languages we can pick things from. Okay, so I want to stop there for just a second and see if anyone has any other thoughts about defining permaculture that they want to contribute.
Can you just say the name of the author of A Pattern Language again?
Sure, Christopher Alexander. And that book was very important in the creation of permaculture. He was looking at simply architecture in a way, but the beginning of the book starts with politics. Yeah, Jenny. And the start of the book starts with how we might distribute political power in a society in a way that's more equitable. And so he was really thinking holistically. Mollison and Holmgren wanted to create a pattern language for sustainable human habitats. So they really brought in this aspect of farming and sustainability. All right, any other thoughts, questions? Before we move on, I do want to come back to this one more time here. And we see the next one. I'm going to point out these questions and just say, pick one of these questions that we'll hopefully come up with in the course of the night and try to answer it and chime in. And the first time you say something tonight, it would be fantastic if you could also give us your name and maybe just where you're from. So that we do get to have a little bit of contact with each other. All right. And then again, please, if you're in the Transformative Adventures group, you can introduce yourself on that thread. I will get over there to take a look at it in a few minutes too, and we'll add to that as well. So what are some of the problems? Man, problems. We all know the world's got problems. What are some of the big problems that you see the world facing today? Or perhaps even that you or people like you seem to face? And please chime in.
Land access.
Land access, absolutely. This is especially true for people who would want to farm or find a self-sufficiency lifestyle, working together. Humans are socially alienated, super lonely. Yeah, that's true. Something that we talked about in the Transformative Adventures group recently is that in a lot of ways, modern society with corporations have tried to insinuate themselves into pretty much every part of our lives to commoditize it. I read this book, actually it was in Swindled by B. Wilson, that really pointed out to me that especially after the Cold War era, that corporations were really looking at the American lifestyle and the global lifestyle and finding what parts of it that people were doing that they could turn into products, you know? And so we had the washing machine invented, and Crisco, and you know, canned foods in a huge way. And basically, they took away everything that used to build community and turned it into products. Oh, there's so much commercial land out there, right, that we could be taking advantage of. It's, you know, Matthew Stevens just mentioned the problem of land access for people. Yeah, we've got lawns, you know, acres and acres of lawns all over America that we're watering and fertilizing. So, yeah, it kind of says, Bill Mollison used to say, the problems of the world are increasingly complicated, but the solutions remain embarrassingly simple. We have people who need housing and land, and we have houses and land sitting empty. So here are a few of my pet problems. I just want to mention some. Oh, yeah, that's my subtle pet problems joke. Around the world, drought, yeah, lack of water access. So water and resource depletion is at the top of my slide there. Biodiversity, a lot of us know that we're being what's in a state that a lot of scientists are calling the 6th global mass extinction event. And we're losing species every day. Inequality, climate change, health. You know, I think we have a global health problem too before the epidemic and pandemic. And I think we're going to continue to have things like the pandemic until we repair our ecosystems. Junk food, antibiotic resistance. So these are just a few of mine. And a few years ago, I was speaking at a conference, and I put this together because I was, we were talking earlier about how Bill Mollison made different definitions of permaculture based on who he was talking to. And I really recommend doing that for you too. So if you're talking to someone who's a hippie, you might have one definition of permaculture. If you're talking to someone who's a farmer, you might use a different definition. You know, we can really try to approach people where they're at. In this case, I really wanted to shake people up. So I put this together. These are facts about our food system. By 2050, we will need to produce 30% more food than we do today, according to the USDA. Current world ag requires 1.6 acres per person, according to the FAO. Due to land losses, by 2050, and this is because of climate change and other factors, sea level rising, we will only have 0.5 acres per person for agriculture. So already we will have to produce 30% more food with less than 50%, or with a lot less land. Climate will make crops yield 25% less than they do now. We will have to produce this food with less water, less fossil fertility, less soil, less biodiversity, and less effective pesticides. How does that make you feel?
Makes me feel like we need to redefine what is food. I'm thinking we need to redefine what is food, perhaps. I think, doesn't Mollison talk about that when he used kind of a crude statement in the designer's manual, but he said that we've got dogs and cats that are running around everywhere, and a few good Asian restaurants would take care of that. Probably not the nicest way to say it, but he was kind of rough with his tongue, I think. But I think we have cultural restrictions on what we consider food. How many of us want to eat the bugs in our backyard?
Yeah, and you know, Noah just pointed out too, how we define food and how we define agricultural land, because a lot of those statistics are based on the idea that we're just going to have food from the corporate system instead of having people growing food for themselves where they live, having us producing for ourselves. So that was the gloom and doom slide, but we can solve these problems. So let's look at that. We can solve problems holistically by designing human habitats to meet our needs by working with nature instead of against it. Or, as one of my heroes, Jeff Lawton, says, all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. Well, I mean, that's a fun thing for hippies to say, right? It sounds good. I like gardens. Can gardens really solve problems? Well, let's see. I would be curious. I wish you could raise hands. In fact, I'm so interested to see this. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and switch over to the slide view. And I at least see a few pictures of people. I'm going to say, wave your hand if you know this place, the Los Plateaux. So some people do. No, okay. Well, yep, some people do. That's great. We're going to go back to that. Ah, yes, Tish. So, let's see, where was that at? Does this look like a nice place to go for a vacation, perhaps? Maybe if you like deserts. So here's the thing that's really shocking about this picture is that this is an anthropogenic ecosystem. Humans made this desert. What we know now is the Los Plateaux was the cradle of Chinese civilization. And it was once one of, yeah, if you have a video about this, please, yep, China's sorrow. I really love this. I hope we add that to the Transformative Adventures group on Facebook too. Somebody should get that up over there for us. It's a really inspiring thing. But this, we know now that this desert, as Brad Lancaster said, was created by humans through bad agriculture. It was once the most fertile place in all of China. This was an abundant, lush, fertile ecosystem. And we degraded it really quickly. In fact, but here's a really scary thing. Soil scientists in the United States say our current civilization is doing this to the United States at a faster rate than it's ever been done anyplace else. This right here is our future. And this is an ecosystem that is filled with problems. Problems flow from this ecosystem. You know, this contributes to climate change. This ecosystem is sequestering no carbon. Obviously, people who live here have no natural wealth. Natural disasters here. When it rains, the silt washes down from this denuded landscape and fills the Yellow River with silt. It's why it's called the Yellow River. It's why it's called China's sorrow, because it causes floods. So water pollution, class discrimination. People who live here now are, you know, have a class stigma about them because they come from this place of poverty. So think about that. Class stigma and caste are associated with an ecosystem. Extreme low biodiversity, low food access, poor health and nutrition. Here are some interesting things. It has high crime. It has poor academic achievement. All of those things came from the ecosystem. And this was something that this was the birthplace of China's civilization. There was an idea that for thousands of years, we've tried to improve the quality of life for the people who lived here. And solutions evaded us until we got the idea to invest holistically, bye Jenny, in creating solutions from the ecosystem, investing in the ecosystem first. How are we going to do that? They started out by thinking, well, every mountain needs a hat. So we started to plant forests on the tops. And they all need belts to keep the trousers up. So we planted fertility strips and made terraces along the sides. And every mountain needs a good pair of boots. So they started getting wetlands at the bottom to catch that silt and fertility, and then wildlife would trickle it back up the mountains, creating a fertility cycle. In a short period of time, this is just 3 years into the project, it really started to transform the landscape. And 10 years on, it looked like this. And after 10 years, pretty much all of those problems we had talked about before had started to go away. In 10 years, incomes rose by 4 times. The community started stabilizing. Measures of nutrition and health went up. Poverty went down. Crime went down. All of the problems that were in this ecosystem, in this landscape before, had started to be reversed and changed. Even the social problems. That is a really interesting thing, isn't it? What do you think? Is this a place you want to go to visit for vacation? Guess what? A lot of people do. Any comments or thoughts about that?
That's pretty amazing. And I wish we could do that in a lot of different places. And this is Denise from Plainwell, Michigan, not too far from where Mike lives.
Thanks, Denise. Well, yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that we as permaculturists, as a global movement, are trying to do by solving our own problems. So here is another version or vision of that in the same time of the year over different, same time of the year, like 3 years later. Here's a great set of videos now. Here's one you can Google. If you go on YouTube and search for From Poverty to Permaculture, you'll see some great videos about projects going on in India to do the same sort of thing. Here's one of them. That's a human regenerated ecosystem right there. We can even do this in the desert. You can Google Greening the Desert by Jeff Lawton. They went into the Jordan Valley at a girls' school, the lowest place on earth, a place where they said there's no way you can have a garden here. And they produced a food forest in the middle of the desert. And we can do the same thing in the United States. Someone mentioned Brad Lancaster, I think Jenny did. And this is something here in the United States where we're doing the same exact kind of thing. I had another slide on that, but looks like I lost it. We can do the same thing with farmland. This is New Forest Farm. It's a permaculture farm that is regenerating the American savanna and doing it in a way that's economically viable. And we can do it in the home landscape, at the suburban level. This is one of my favorite, most inspiring permaculture videos ever. You can Google or go on YouTube and find an invitation for wildness. We're going to post all of these videos and resources over in that Transformative Adventures group over the next day in the thread. So you'll be able to check these out, any of these that are interesting to you. This is probably one of my #1 most inspiring permaculture videos ever, about this family that purchased an old home on very depleted landscape and transformed it into a mix of native forest and food forest so that it produces for all of their needs too. Really inspiring. And we can do it in the city too. This is one of my heroes, Ron Finley. And he has an interesting story because this is his health strip food forest in LA. He did this amazing thing. He started putting these in. And did the city come and give him a beautification award? No, they gave him a bunch of fines. And so he fought it, and they built more gardens and had this big big movement. And he did a TED talk, and the city came and they said, okay, fine, you don't have to pay your fines. And they passed an ordinance that is now legal to plant food gardens and gardens on health strips anywhere in LA. So he changed that. He didn't wait for someone else to fix it for him. He got involved. He did the thing. He fixed it. We could say the same thing. I'm sorry I lost these Brad Lancaster slides there, because Brad Lancaster did the same thing here. I really would love to show you the before picture. I'll get to it in a little bit. And same thing. He wanted to make these curb cuts to soak water from the street into his desert landscape. And the city said, no, you can't do that. So he did it anyway and turned it into this. And then the city came back and said, well, this is a great idea. We should do this everywhere in the city. And now it's legal to do this everywhere in the city. And it's being spread all over. We're doing curb cuts all over the place now in the United States. It's spreading. So same thing with what Ron Finley did. We can do this. This is another thing, set of events from City Repair. One of my favorite permaculture designers, Mark Lakeman, he and his neighborhood, they were having a problem of cats, that people were speeding down the street here. And I think 3 cats in the neighborhood had been hit by cars, and they thought it was only a matter of time before one of the kids got hit. So they went to the city, and the city wouldn't do anything about it. They wouldn't do a speed bumps. There was nothing they could do. Their hands were tied. So they got together as a neighborhood and brainstormed. And this was actually an idea he kind of credits the kids with, coming up and painting a mural on the street. And now when people drive through, they asked the city about it, and the city said, no way, you can't do that. Oh, they got together and they did it anyway. And then it solved the problem. They came back and they did a traffic study. They found this has actually slowed down the traffic, and it worked. And they were able to build the city square, this village square right in their neighborhood, because the other problem they had was everyone felt disconnected. So this solved multiple problems at the same time. The city came back and they said, fine. They passed an ordinance that you can do this on any intersection in the city now. And so we're getting this spreading out from here too. It's being done all over America. A friend of mine did something like this in her location. And here's another one up from the area. One of my, if you know Iris Potter in Kalamazoo, for the local people, she was involved in helping build this. This is Dignity Village. There in Portland, they were having an issue with a homeless population that the city just kept kicking around the town. And they were disenfranchised. There was nothing they could do. The permaculture community got together there. Mark Lakeman actually did some of the designs for these buildings. They got together and they built a village. Instead, they replaced the tent community with a structure. Of course, the city said, you can't do that. And now Dignity Village is a model for positive community change all over the country. We didn't wait, we just stepped up and we did it and we made it work. And then it became the model. So you're kind of seeing a bit of a theme here. And the theme is we have the power to make incredible change ourselves. We don't have to wait for thought leaders or politicians or CEOs to do it for us. We can do it ourselves together and as individuals and as a community. We don't have to wait. We have the power to do it. And we can do it even starting at our own homes. This here was my lawn when I moved in here about 8-9 years ago now. What do you think? Pretty? So this is this here. Yeah, I'll be honest. I didn't get along well with the lawn. I would give and give and give, and it would take and take and take. I had to mow it and water it, and it was still dead all the time. And it gave me nothing back for all of the work I put into it. And it was causing climate change and had zero biodiversity. It's kind of a bummer. I decided to say bye to the lawn, as probably most of you on this call have done. And in just a couple years, it looked like that. And in about 4 years, excuse me, it looked like this. And this is an ecosystem that requires much less from me. In fact, something that people say all the time is, wow, this is a beautiful garden. I wish I had time to do this. And I always say, I don't have time not to. This garden takes less time to maintain than it used to mow that whole big stupid lawn. And in return, it provides most of our fruit and vegetables and a large percent of our calories on just a few hours of labor per week on average. It decreases our reliance on inequitable and abusive human labor practices in the food system. It significantly reduces our time spent doing yard work, and the kind of work we're doing is more rewarding too. It provides us with a very diverse, nutritious, and safe diet, including salads almost every day. It infiltrates almost all of our rainwater, reducing our impact on the stormwater system. You know what? You and I pay taxes to maintain the stormwater system for people who have lawns. Think about that. It provides habitat for native plants and wildlife. It provides medicine and rewarding exercise, significantly reduces our carbon footprint because landscape is sequestering carbon. It recycles 100% of the household food waste. It reduces our heating and cooling costs, provides us with a better connection to nature, and provides us a better connection with our neighbors and community. Hundreds of people have visited our house. In fact, in most years, hundreds visit us every year for food and plants and to hang out. You know, this is a landscape that gives me back a lot. And it gives back to the soil too. I'd like to point this out. Here's before and after picture from, or actually this is the same time. This is soil that has been managed under polyculture and perennials with no compost added on the right. And on the left is just what our soil is like with additions of compost. Oh, that's right there on the left. Bye. Yep. That is soil that I have been adding compost to. And the soil on the right hasn't even had compost. It's just had permaculture. So, and just to show some of the kinds of food that the garden produces over the course of the year. These are just some basic kind of daily yields that we'll get in the summer. So all of that is way better than the lawn, I think. I'm going to stop there and see if there are people who have comments or thoughts about that. Bye, Laura.
Yeah, Mike, that's that's amazing work. And I like the pictures of the yields too. I think it represents I think a realistic and true permaculture garden, because obviously you got a lot of diversity, and yeah, it looks wonderful. And I also like the before the picture of the lawn. Was that a satellite picture?
Yeah, Google Images.
Google Images. Okay. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think this is really important, the documentation that we so often miss from a lot of the small suburban gardens and urban gardens, to show, the before and the after, and then also the photo of the yields. And, I mean, I could actually look at the picture and kind of quantify the diversity. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's at this point, it's a few hundred species. If we're talking about edible species, it's over 200 species. They're usually between 200 and 300 species in the garden. It's not quite 300 the last time I counted. Someone asked, Sarah, I think, asked about how we did it. And yeah, in a minute, we're going to talk about the main strategy for that. And one of the big issues here is we'd say catching and storing energy. One of our permaculture principles is to catch and store energy. In Bill Mollison's version, this was kind of captured in his energy principles, if you're familiar with those. And we'll talk about this more in a little bit. But one of the ideas is that we like to catch and store energy in a permanent garden beds, which is why our garden requires so much less maintenance than it would if it were an acre. It's about an acre total, you know, 3/4 of an acre. Why it takes so much less work than a normal garden? Because we take a section like this in the picture and sheet mulch it. And oh, that's awesome. Yeah, do the documentation. It's great. I mean, being able to see things like this is so important. And get it done, get it right, get that planted. And here we are, like 6-7 years later, that garden area still looks like this. You know, this is a slightly different area, but it's done at the same time. And here we see sea kale, edible bellflowers, garlic, chives, mint, and apple tree, and artichoke, all together, a pear in the background, valerian. And so if we get that right, we can do one bed, get it, boom, move on to the next, and do that and walk that around the property. That way we catch and store energy in that kind of way. Whereas when you're doing annual agriculture or annual gardens, every year you have to go back and redig that bed, the same one, and you have to replant all the annuals, and you have to nurse them through when they're babies, when they're most vulnerable, and then you have to work to do all that harvest at once, and then the next year you have to redo all of that over again. So if in your first year you use like 50% of your free time to do your garden, and then the second year you add another 50%, you're done. You're never getting another thing done in your garden ever again. As soon as you go away to your sister's wedding, the whole garden's going to turn into weeds and pests, right? So when you do perennial systems like this and walk them around, we can really create gardens that can last and require very low maintenance. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and we can do the same kind of thing. This is David Holmgren's Flower of Permaculture, showing that we can take that same approach and apply it to other things in the garden, right? We can apply it to tools and technology. These are all of the areas required for a sustainable society. And as permaculturists, we try to apply that same logic to all of them. All right. Well, we're going to go on and talk just briefly. So here's 2 sets of permaculture principles that you can look into. And luckily, this makes it nice and easy. You can find them both at permacultureprinciples.org and permacultureprinciples.com. One of them is the Mollison Principles, and the other one are David Holmgren's set of permaculture principles. And they're very similar. I like to say that the Holmgren principles are better for conversing with people and sharing our values. And the Holmgren or the Mollison principles are probably much better at functional design stuff. These are the ones that I think really are powerful design principles. But I like them both. I like to teach them both. We'll get into these more if you come back and you do the full permaculture design certificate course with me. I like to introduce them and start that off as a topic. And then we're going to talk about just one tonight, 1 or 2, and talk about, so we can see how this plays out as a design thing and how we can really put this to use in our lives. And hopefully as we do this, I'll be giving you some tips and tricks that you can put to use in the garden. And hopefully everybody on here will learn something new. That's a big challenge for me because there are a bunch of really brilliant, really knowledgeable people on here. So we'll see. I'm going to stop for just a minute here and see if we have any questions or any thoughts or anything anybody wants to share.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Musser from Hardin, Montana. But how many years did it take before, like for your perennial garden, before you started seeing progress? Because sometimes we get discouraged because of how long it takes.
Yeah, one thing that I learned in projects before we started this project that was kind of a big thing is to really focus or follow ecological succession. So in the first year or two, when I start a guild, I almost always start a guild with like a Three Sisters type garden. So instead of cover cropping, I Three Sisters or I Jerusalem artichoke. Jerusalem artichoke tractoring is a really great tool. So if you plant, you can just plant Jerusalem artichokes into lawn. I know you have a different climate up there and Jerusalem artichokes don't work. There might be other things like camas that you could use in a way similarly. But same thing. And you have irrigation, if I remember. So you do have some water too. So I usually start with annuals. And the reason why is I find a lot of people do get discouraged early on and burn out before the perennials come on. So something that's really easy is like Three Sisters for the initial year, planting some of those early perennials like Jerusalem artichokes so that those come on next. And we have this full succession moving from annuals in year one to the perennials. So for us, our garden, we traced it out, and our garden definitely, profited over $1,000 in terms of the produce, more back than we had to put in, even in the very first year. So, and then by the second and third year, it was already getting really productive. So that's something that I always try to recommend is follow that arc of succession, get some annuals in the first year if you can. Does that help at all? So
Yeah,
for us,
that's really good. Now when you said to like walk the plants around, what did you mean exactly?
sure. The usual strategy that I tend to focus on is Bill Molson called it locuses that intersect at some point, which is an ecosystem restoration technique. Do one small guild, maybe like 30 by 40 is what I usually recommend. And that acts as your nursery too. So if you focus on the Transformative Adventures website, I have an article, I think 2 articles on, one is called like prolific plants for a landscape, something like that. And there's one on annuals too. And those are things where like, they're super productive, super high value plants. Oh, another one I have is called hamburger plants, something like that, hamburger perennials. And it's that same idea. So if you get that 30 by 40 section right, you can take those super prolific, super valuable plants, things like crones and skirt, even potatoes can fit into that, and they'll produce tons of new plants for you. And you can, that guild is stable, you can plant your next guild, load that up, and move on to the next one. And don't, I recommend start with a 30 by 40 area when you start one guild, then move on to the next one. It's really the way to go, in my opinion.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Yeah. I agree. If 30 by 40 sounds too large for you, in a little bit, I have a 10 by 10 kind of garden. It's just a 10 by 10 bed. And start with that. Start with one little keyhole bed, 10 by 10, because it's better using this strategy of catching and storing energy. It's better to do a 10 by 10 bed that's stable and turns into a little self-maintaining ecosystem, and then move on to the next one next year, than it is to do too much and never get to a stable system, right? That's my opinion.
Well, I'll comment on that. Bill says, build a nucleus and work outwards from there. Or he also says, basically create a guild, and now one perimeter encloses all your needs. And I think that's pretty much the same thing that what you're saying, Mike. And yeah. Mhm. So,
Yeah, if a great strategy, if you want to reduce a permaculture approach to the absolute you know, strategy. I'm going to mute everybody. We had some noise on there. So when you chime back in, you can unmute yourself. So if you want to reduce it to the bare minimum, you can just shoot for that, 20 by 20 square foot area and load it up with biodiversity. Go for like 30 species of plant at really tight densities, one plant per square foot, and walk away and let that system simplify. It's going to work from one cell, let that go, let it simplify, and you have your nursery. You have your nursery of plants. At the end of 2 or 3 years, maybe it's only going to be 15 plants left. But at the end of those years, you have your 15 plants that are going to make stable guilds that you can move out and conquer your whole landscape. Then you can add other things back into it because there's going to be niches in there. You're going to be able to add more biodiversity to that. Well, that's kind of a basic strategy.
Hey, Mike, I got something to offer real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's I know we're supposed to be announcing where we live and all, and certainly something that I do in Central Florida isn't always going to be relative to something in Montana, but I think this will be. And the idea is that you start small and then you spread. That's fantastic, and that has helped me a lot. But I have still tried to do too much, and I pay the price, but it's a lesson. Somebody mentioned to me, I was at a gathering a while back in Tampa Bay, and the idea that we live in an instant gratuity society. We get everything so fast. You think about frozen dinners and instant food and fast food. So I go out there to do this permaculture thing, and I want things fast. I want to plant a tree on Monday. I want to plant an apple tree on Monday and have apple pie on Wednesday. And that's just not going to work. I have got to constantly remind myself that I cannot expect to do in 5 weekends or 5 months or even 5 years what it took nature 5,000 or 500,000 years to do, which is to build this incredible topsoil and these lush forests and all that. So I keep reminding myself of that. And I have told myself in this project, we're now in about the 3rd year, that I am not gonna check myself. I am not gonna compare in that sense until I hit the 5-year point. Then I can make some decisions. Am I sticking to that? I think primarily, but the idea is that it is going to take a long time if we're emulating this succession, basically turning a poorly managed prairie into a savanna and then into a forest. It's not going to happen quickly. It's not going to happen quickly. That's what I wanted to add to that. Whoever gave me that advice a while back was spot on. I've tried to keep that with me. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Matthew, go for it.
I just want to, I'm a Bible thumper. So if you just give me 30 seconds, I just want to have some church. Okay. So on page 53 of the Bible, we got this wonderful nucleus. It says the golden rule. This is the golden rule. So if the Bible says it's the golden rule, then that's what it is. We got the golden ratio, but here we got the golden rule is to develop the nearest area first, get it under control, and then expand the perimeter. A single perimeter will then enclose all your needs. And then here's a nice little dooryard garden, some Mollison poetry. And then, as I was saying on page 65, here we got develop a nucleus completely. And that's, to sum it up, starting with a nucleus and expanding outwards to the most successful and morale building and easily achieved way to proceed. So, basically small and slow solutions, and just, basically you want to build up confidence. And then here on page 81, we got the golden rule of design. keep it small and keep it varied. So that's all.
Thank you. That was awesome, Matthew. I mean, I just totally agree. And that's the kind of thing that made all the difference for me too, personally. If you're not entire, that was from the Permaculture Designer's Manual by Bill Mollison. We'll include a PDF link in this introduction thread in the Transformative Adventures group. It's just one of the best books ever written, and it's really fantastic. It's very expensive to buy. If you look at the PDF, I always recommend you know, going out and supporting Tagari Press and buying it too. But I feel it's okay to go and take a look at the PDF first before you do. But it's a great book, and yeah, it's the Permaculture Bible.
Also
So-
known as the Big Black Book.
Yes. Although the first version I ever had of it was in a binder. So, yeah, thank you, Matthew. So, but this in permaculture, there's also an idea of stun, sheer, total, utter neglect, where some people like to plant out an entire landscape all at once. And it's kind of an alternative view within permaculture. It's not, it has a role, is what I always say, but I've also seen a lot of people get discouraged. Whereas people who do one small guild, get it right, and then move on to the next, tend to be happier. You know, we really can design little mini ecosystems that are fairly stable, that only require harvest. Then almost all of your work in the garden is just harvest. So I have this picture up to show that idea of annuals. When we look at a garden bed or a garden like this that has a lot of perennials throughout it in later years, they all started like this. This is one of my guilds early on. You can see some perennials already establishing. And you see a nitrogen fixer in there, the clover, and lots of annuals in it too. So a lot, you see a squash coming in, I'll thin out the other greens around that squash and then let the squash run by late in the summer. And so a garden like this transitions very naturally from annuals and high value perennials in year one. And then I harvest out those annuals to make room for the perennials as they establish. And by the time I'm done, it's all perennials left over, you know? Well, not all perennials. There's lots of room for annuals in our garden. We grow lots of annuals, like you saw those pictures. But it's a perennial managed landscape. The plants manage my garden for me. Isn't that a kind of an interesting concept?
And Mike,
Yeah.
this is Peter. We're in Fenville, Michigan, and about an hour north of Mike in Kalamazoo, just for reference. How much of your annual is self-seeding now?
A lot. Most of it. Almost
I mean,
all.
that's just a natural progression there.
It is. So I harvest a perennial, and if I don't put in another perennial in its place, an annual will pop up, or I'll put in a tomato or something like that too. So I do grow some annuals from starts and put them in, but if I didn't in a year, the garden would still be almost as productive. It would just be some different stuff. I wouldn't get quite as many tomatoes or quite as many of what I'm planning on, but I would get almost the same level of productivity if I just decided to take the spring off. In fact, to prove that, we pretty much did that this year. So, you know, I did plant out some tomatoes and peppers for people who were here and saw the garden. But a lot of it was just self-sown.
We have an unusual situation compared to what seems to be the vast majority of people coming into permaculture. And that is, instead of having some previously farmed or suburban stripped kind of landscape, we bought 20 acres of woodlands. And as near as I can tell from aerial photographs going back, it was abandoned from farmland at least 100 years ago. I think they tried, found this area was just too wet, and gave up. So we butt right up against the Bravo Wildlife Refuge, and we're in the Allegan State Forest. So instead of trying to get into a perennial situation, instead of trying to grow trees and so on, we get the challenge of trying to insinuate the human productive aspect into what we've already got. And it's a challenge in part because there's just really nobody talking about it from the perspective we have here.
Yeah, the pattern there that we're kind of working with is almost more like Swidden agriculture, where you're looking at making sustainable disturbances in the forest ecosystem to restart succession in some places. And you already have all the fertility you need built up. In a way, you need some of that disturbance to reset the soil ecology, so you're getting more annuals again and stuff like that. And finding ways to do that that are gentle, that increase the total overall biodiversity of your ecosystem without harming it or getting it out of balance. Yeah, it's a very interesting and different challenge that we can also work with as permaculturists.
Yep.
Well, at that note, thank you for that comment too. Peter, and everyone, it is 7:05. I usually take this, I'd love to spend at least 2 hours through this discussion here, and then I'll hang out afterwards and talk more. But I would like to give us a 5-minute kind of bio break here if you need to, get up and move around. And we'll come back in at 7:10 and get started again. We're going to be talking about this idea of catching and storing energy and different strategies for that. And keep in mind, what are ways we can work with nature? And I'm hoping you'll end up with a few tips and tricks that you can use by the end of this talk. All right, back at 7:10. If anybody wants to take over while I'm gone and you have some questions or have some thoughts you want to share, please have at it.
I want to talk about hippies.
Just keep it nice. All right, I'll be back.
Excuse me. Does anyone know if this is being recorded where I can watch it later? I've got another meeting going to be starting.
Well,
I believe
I've
it
let
is.
yes. And we'll post it to the Transformative Adventures group. So in the thread for this discussion, so you'll be able to catch it then too.
Okay, I sure appreciate that. Thank you all.
As you get older, the Prevision helps you. In clinical trials, Prevision improved short-term memory. Prevision, healthier brain, better life. $10,000. Now category has been named Best Game Show Category by Game Show Category Magazine. So we'll put the crossword, and the clue is North Lane. And Colette, you start.
Woo. Well, I'm back if anybody has any questions for me while we're waiting. Looks like over in the Transformative Adventures group, we've got links to pattern language. And we've got that super inspiring video, Hope in a Changing Climate. Thank you, Joey, for posting all of these videos. You got the greening of the desert. We've got everything. This is fantastic. Joey did great work on all that. He's got all of those videos. I love all of those. Fantastic things. Yeah, that's another great one. The Spackman videos. Oh, wow, fantastic stuff. Thanks, guys, for, yeah, Michael Pilarski has some great videos too. Thanks, everybody, for throwing those resources up in that thread. I'm going to get some of my own up in there too. And that's going to be a great introduction to permaculture thread there. You could spend a month exploring inspiring permaculture videos just off that thread. So thank you for everyone for helping make that cool. And it's 7:11. Before I get rolling again, anyone else have any more thoughts, questions, comments to guide our next section here? Thanks, Noah. All right, we got some more. Yeah.
Perhaps if we redefine what food is, we could redefine our gardening efforts like foraging. I'm here in New York in the middle of the winter. There's food in the garden. There's field garlic on the lawn, garlic, mustard. There's Jerusalem artichokes. There's a lot of food even. It's hiding in plain sight in the middle of the lawnscaping.
Absolutely. I have a great thread on that I recently posted in our local VanCal permaculture group. On the Transformative Adventures page, if you use the search function on that page, you'll find a couple of articles on winter foraging and winter vegetables. And I think I've got like a dozen all in one article there. And you're right. Nobody ever eats these things. There's food all over the place right now. You can go outside and pick a whole bunch of food. And it's not in the grocery store. And some of it is, almost all of it is more nutrient dense too. All right. So what other questions did we have on here too? Personal challenges and challenges in the garden. Really interesting to think about whether or not the things we're talking about tonight will be useful for those. So when we get to the end here, hopefully we'll be able to talk about some kinds of problems we all have in our gardens or lives, and what sort of strategies we could find to catch and store energy on those. So tonight we're focusing on mainly this one principle, and this is kind of captured again in Mollison's, energy principles. You see in this slide, the principle of energy inputs, energy cycling, and energy efficiency. Holmgren kind of simplifies those into catch and store energy, which is what ecosystems do. So the magical thing about ecosystems is that they catch energy and store them, so they grow in wealth and health and abundance over time. The ecological definition of ecology health is a system that grows in biomass and biodiversity over time. So that's one way of saying they gain energy. So if you just stop mowing your lawn will start to grow way more food over time and more food for wildlife. And in 20 or 30 years, it'll be a forest filled with useful biomass for all sorts of life. A lawn, on the other hand, has very little energy stored in it. You know, human systems don't work that way though. You buy a car, and if you don't do anything to maintain it, it doesn't grow more valuable over time. It turns into a jalopy. Well, wouldn't it be smart if we humans could find ways to produce systems that meet our needs, that catch and store energy and grow in wealth and health over time? Well, one way to think about permaculture is that what permaculturists do is we are investors. We invest our time and resources and energy into regenerative investments that will grow wealthier and healthier and more abundant over time. We could say permaculture is the gift you give yourself in 10 years. So all of these kinds of things that we focus on, foraging, low maintenance productive landscapes, herbalism, increasing biodiversity, smart energy investments that pay for themselves over time. These are things, social structures, networking together and creating communities of like-minded people. These are all ways we catch and store energy. I'll talk about a few more. We can, like we already saw on the Lost Plateau, we saw catching and storing water into the soil and into the system. So when we started our garden plan here, one of the very first things we started doing is sketches like this on what our whole site water system would look like. And we mapped that out, diagrams, and then we did details. And because of this, and because we have these multiple layers of water resilient systems, I pretty much don't water the garden. Our garden requires pretty much, other than watering in seedlings, that's pretty much the only watering it is required over years. Now we have rain barrels, but pretty much the only use they get is watering in seedlings. You know, if it's a really bad drought, we'll do some watering. So of course, one of the classic ways permaculturists do this is creating what you see here is called a swale. And swales are tree planting systems, or ways we establish trees and landscapes. And they just catch and store water in the landscape. spread it out, slow it down, and soak it in where it can stay there and be available to the plants. So we're catching and storing energy in the landscape. Once you do this, the water soaks in to that swale, and then it feeds those trees over a long period of time. Here's kind of a trick or a thought. Bill Mollison always said the best place to store water is in the ground. Because if you store water in, say, a rain barrel, which is good, it's good to store water in a rain barrel. Especially it shows people that you're valuing the water and valuing the resource. But in a rain barrel, it will evaporate. In a well-designed, healthy ecosystem, the plants actually will catch and hold the water where it is useful in the root zone of the plants over a long period of time. And there's pretty good research to show that that water soaked into the soil will tend to last longer than kept out in the rain barrel. So something like a swale gets the water where it needs to go. We can blow this up into a whole strategy, but one of the best things to know is design a garden so that it catches and stores its own water, and then that saves us time for watering later. And we can catch sun energy. This is a famous sun trap design that you often see in permaculture gardens, especially in temperate climates. This is less useful in the tropics, but you still see it some. In fact, you always see this in annual agriculture in the tropics where they're doing wind agriculture. It's a concept of farming in forest openings. So it creates this system where there's shelter, and we have small low plants to the south or to the sunward side. And as we go away from the sun, or to the north in the northern hemisphere, we get taller plants. So that we have this whole system that catches and practically stores every bit of sun energy that can go into it, turns it into plant material. So this kind of a system, this kind of a shape of a garden is exactly what we have at Lily House too, where the whole garden is designed as a series of sun traps like this. It gives shelter to the garden. It produces a nice warm microclimate for growth. It can also reduce temperatures in some ways too. This is a really great, important design. We already talked about the strategy of doing no-dig garden beds and walking them around the landscape. And that's how we've done pretty much all of ours. Most of the projects that I do are based on the same way. If I were doing just annual gardening and annual farming, I'd be tied up in the summer. As it is, I go out and I create new gardens other places every single year. And the reason why is, a permaculture design install business isn't compatible with having your own garden if you have an annual garden. But now my garden requires pretty much no new installation. We're pretty much done with that section or that, that work. So I have time during the garden setup season to go out and do that work. If I were doing annual gardens here, I'd be too busy at my own place. You see in my picture of our raised beds, we used a lot of urbanite. These are some really lovely pictures here from Northwest Edible is a blog. They're doing some permaculture stuff. These are really beautiful urbanite. We're saying recycled concrete. It's important to know that concrete is responsible for 5% of global carbon. So catching and storing embodied energy of these materials and reusing them is really important. And look, it's beautiful too. That recycled copper as well. I love this picture. She did such a great job with these. I think there's an element of catching and storing energy that is beautiful in landscapes too. To me, that looks like, yeah, absolutely. To me, that looks like when you go to Europe and you see that they have caught and stored culture in beauty into 1,000-year-old architecture. Here, we knock everything down after 50 years. Then we say, well, America's boring. I got to go to Europe where it's beautiful. So there's something to be said for catching and storing energy there too. We've already talked about catching and storing energy in perennial vegetables. Oh, here's a list of some of my favorites. In the chat, you'll see I gave you a couple free gifts. Like I said, I love to make sure I'm giving you all, everyone I interact with, every time I interact with people, my goal is to invest in them and show them how to invest in their own regenerative assets. A couple of things that I think are really important intellectual capital are knowing good perennial vegetables and guilds, and I gave you a few worksheets on those in the folder for this class. So I think that was posted back in the chat. So if anybody doesn't have that, someone could please look back in the chat, find that folder and repost it for me. That would be fantastic. If somebody wants to do some work for me right now. But these are just a few of my favorites still. I think I've added in the bottom of this picture, it's probably one of my favorites. These days I'm really big on skirt and crones, and this one here in the bottom right corner is so beautiful. What's that?
Sea kale.
Yeah, love that plant. And look how productive that is. All of those flowers are really delicious broccoli. And this is after harvesting a ton of it. So every year we harvest a ton of this plant, and it still produces all of those leftovers are those flowers are all leftovers that we didn't get to. So a super productive plant. It's like every season that one plant probably produces like 7 or 8 heads of broccoli or cauliflower off of one, grocery store size big heads off of one plant, and it's perennial. It's like 5 or 6 years old. Been doing that for 5 or 6 years. Here's another area of our garden, another little view. I like to point out that black kale there is a perennial as well. That particular plant now is something like 7 or 8 years old. It was when it came in one of the first years in our garden. And that's one that has just kept on coming back. It's a great perennial and a real beauty too. Look at this picture. There's like 10 perennial plants just in this little picture of garden. There's a little few leaves of sea kale coming up in there. There's monarda. I think there's some oregano in the background, apricots, pear. Oh, it's lovely to see these perennials. Perennials catch and store our energy. We don't have to replant them every year. They come back every year. Trees are, of course, some of the most important perennials, and plant guilds. If you're not familiar with this term guilds, a guild is a designed ecosystem, ideally one that is stable, which makes it different than a companion planting. A companion planting are plants that are ideally like help each other, right? A guild is ideally like a designed ecosystem that becomes stable and self-regulating because the plants in it share access to resources and really help each other out, have different niches. And as you can see from this picture, I think guilds can be really beautiful in almost any landscape. A few years on, here's that same guild from a different direction. And it's still beautiful and productive. And this guild, after being established, this one is about, this one is probably 20 by 15 feet. And it's been stable now this is one of the first guilds we ever planted. So 8-9 years on, this guild has required almost no annual maintenance. It's just now getting, this year, I was a little bit embarrassed having students over to see some of the grasses encroaching, but it's still very stable even with grass encroachment in a few places in this guild. So it's really stable guild. Imagine, think about that. If you've been an annual gardener, you can produce highly productive food gardens in 1 year that will last and continue producing an abundant amount of food for 7 or 8 years, 10 years into the future. Kind of changes the whole perspective, doesn't it? So nature stores energy in complexity, in relationships is what we're talking about. So that's this idea of guilds and guild roles. This is another tool we can use to design really vibrant, stable ecosystems in our gardens. And because this is so important as a regenerative asset, as a thought tool, I included that whole, those worksheets in the chat. And I'm going to go back, and here's the folders, copy. So repasting this folder here in the chat. So you can take a look at this. I'm very happy with especially this guild worksheet, which has some of the best lists of, oh, I sent that directly to Peter. I want to send that to everyone. So it has some of the best guild role lists that I've seen anywhere. And thanks to everyone who's helped me develop that, including Jason, who's on the call here. It just gives you an idea of how these complex ecosystems can help us do work. This is one of my favorite kind of effects, is this fortress plant role, and this is sorrel. And I love this picture because this sorrel is kicking the lawn's butt. Usually one of the big destroyers of gardens, annual gardens, is lawn encroaching on the gardens. And oftentimes if people start a garden and they're not really aggressively tilling a few times a year, doing annuals, it'll get overrun in a lot of climates with Eurasian grasses. Well, a tool like this, fortress plants, can actually keep and repel grasses out of the garden. This works in ecosystems. You see it everywhere where a forest is encroaching into grassland. These plants have evolved to be able to do that work of kicking the butt of grassland. And guess what? We can put that to work in the garden too. So this actually comes from one of those talks in a PDC with Jeff Lawton and Bill Mollison. And Jeff Lawton actually did a similar garden design to this too. This is my really horrible sketch. Someone who's artistic could do a sketch of this that kicks mine's butt here. But this is really good quality information, I think. So this could be that 10 by 10 basic beginner's permaculture garden makeover. If you want to have a semi-annual kind of garden, this design, as like I said, described by Jeff and Bill and kind of put to use here, involves having those fortress plants, especially to the sunny south side, maybe having some kind of a nitrogen fixer in there, having perennial fortress plants around the edges to control it, and then deep mulch in the inside for the annuals. This becomes an annual garden bed that is very, very, very low maintenance, that will last for 5, 6, 7 years without having to really redo any of the work. And you can plant your annuals into it every year. Ken Fern has done some gardens like this too. He has an article on Plants for a Future about creating this kind of garden too. So
Hey,
this
Mike,
is a common permaculture thing. Yes.
I'm gonna sneak in there for a moment on that keyhole garden. One of the things that we kind of lose track of is the amazing space efficiency that you get when you stop doing rows. Rows are for tractors to drive down. If you're working on a human scale and you have a limited space, keyhole gardens, a tessellated pattern of keyhole gardens, oh my God, you can reach everything you need to reach. You can have the compost in the center of the keyhole. It's just incredibly space efficient. And we tend to sort of lose track of that aspect of the process. People think of it as I'll go plant my rose or my square foot garden. And some of these, like the keyhole, that are unconventional shapes are just so much more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. This is how I do. This is most of our internal garden beds are systems of keyholes like this, or what we call path and node design. And this is a great slide from Gaia's Garden that shows that if you're doing a row design, you know, that requires the same area, 10 by 10 bed will require 40 square feet of path. So in a 100 square foot bed, you've got 40 feet of it, you know, 40% of the bed is just path. Here's another trick to that. Path, maintaining path is like the most difficult thing. No, that's great, thank you. Is the most difficult thing in the garden, the most labor intensive thing. So when you have a garden like this, it's not just a waste of space. This is making work for you. You have to do more weeding when you have this kind of garden bed. If you replace that with beds, like in the second one on the left side, that only requires 10 square feet of path. You have dramatically increased your garden productivity just by changing one element of design. And you've dramatically reduced your weeding too. It's amazing when you start doing this. And this idea of keyholes takes that even further. You reduce your weeding work down to very, very little. And if you get it right, the shade from the vegetables reduces it even more. And this kind of garden requires very little weeding maintenance, and it's got tons more productivity. It's an amazing thing. So yeah, thank you, Peter, for bringing it up. And that kind of garden bed design with perennials along the outside, this is what it looks like. This looks a little bit like it's solid garden bed, but actually this is that kind of keyhole type of design with these fortress plants along the lawn side. That's early on in the garden. And here's, you know, a view of the same thing a few years on. This showing how those work over time. So as you see, we're really talking about perennials. Yep, closed canopy gardening. The more you can get rid of paths and things, the least amount of work you can do. If you want a really great productive garden that's going to be low maintenance, one of the rules is, you know, try to have as little bare soil as possible, have lots of plants, lots of biodiversity. Here's one of my biggest life heroes, Colette O'Neill of Belton Cottage. If you're not familiar with her and her videos on YouTube, do please look her up. Super inspiring. And this is kind of a view into one of her food gardens areas where you see lots of familiar annuals, but you also see perennials too, and really super high, correctly dense polyculture systems with lots of complexity to them. Now, one thing to say about this is that I saw somebody did a video a few years ago on doing perennial gardens or polyculture gardens like this, and they just planted in a bunch of stuff without paying any attention to spacing and let it go. And really, the yield was not impressive. The key to making this work is you are using dynamic plant spacings. We're trying to get plant spacings to be ideal and perfect. A really good book on plant spacings is How to Grow More Vegetables Than You Ever Thought Possible on Less Space Than You Could Ever Imagine by John Jevons. It's the Grow Biointensive book. How to Grow More Vegetables is what people usually call it, just how to grow more vegetables. And that book has ideal research-based spacings. We're going for the same thing in a polyculture system. We're just thinning as we go. We might let it self-sow, and then we pull out things, so we're maintaining good spacings for really great growth. We're not just lazily jamming a bunch of things randomly into a space. You know, we're being careful about plant spacings. We're just doing it in a way where there's also a lot of biodiversity. So this is another way we can get nature to do work for us. Ecologists call this the biodiversity resiliency principle. And that states that the greater amount of biodiversity there is in a system, the greater amount of disease and pest resistance it confers to the individuals in the system. And there's lots of great science on this documenting now that once you get up to a certain number of species, pest and disease problems and even weed problems reduce to almost nothing. So simply having this kind of biodiversity like Colette O'Neill has here, investing in that biodiversity does pest and disease work for us, so we don't have to do that work. And just some pretty pictures of high diversity systems. I like to put in a lot of pretty pictures. Yeah, please chime in.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. I wanted to one, John Jevons, which I think is awesome. He's old school, and I think he doesn't get mentioned enough in From Permaculture People. It's one of those old classic hippie books, but science, science-based and research-based. And I like John in the sense that he quantified how much space that was needed to grow food for one person or one hippie, pick your pick. And Bill did that a lot too. And that's why I really, really appreciate Bill more so than I would say most designers, because, and permaculturists, because Bill talks about, growing as much food as you can on the least amount of land possible. And John Jevons is really one of the only people, aside from maybe Ruth Stout and Luis Riot and certain other old hippie permaculture and organic gardening people. But what I wanted to ask you, which is based more on the ecological diversity and stability, component or relationship and the quantification of that. That's why I like a lot of these old school cats, is because they actually quantified stuff, whereas it seems like a lot of the new hipster types, don't get down to the science and the quantification of it. What, to your knowledge and experience, is that threshold for diversity, biodiversity, and ecological stability, especially specific to edible ecosystems? And your, what is the number of species required to get to that almost non-existent pest problem situation? Do you have a number for that you can throw out? Or
I do, and I love that question because this is one of my favorite things to geek out about. So I'm sorry to everyone for that. I might go on a little bit of a geek journey for a second, and because the answer is there's no low limit on that, and this is the magic thing. So we used to have this idea of companion planting, and scientists were trying to figure out and quantify, does companion planting work? And the thing was, the results were always mixed. And what they found over time was that probably in most cases, companion planting doesn't necessarily work any better than just adding more plants. So what they found is they took companion plants, and yes, in some cases, the companion planting really does work. It was shown in research to work, but then they would put two random plants together and found that got the same effect as the companion planting. And what they found was, in a lot of cases, not all, just adding more biodiversity to a system is what did the trick. So in some cases, even just 2 or 3 plants had more pest and disease resistance in a system than one plant as a monoculture alone. So that's really cool. There's no lower limit to getting benefits of biodiversity. When we're talking about a broader system where we start to get stability, there's now been some research on that too. And the research says all systems will decrease in complexity. The systems will simplify. So if you plant 30 plants into a 20 by 20 bed, you probably will lose some of the species as it stabilizes. Maybe you'll only have 20 left, right? When it comes to stability. The crazy thing is that I should say wild thing is with this is that the more plants you have in the system, the greater percentage will be in the end when it stabilizes. So the fewer you will lose. I'm probably not making any sense. Let me try to give an example. If you start with 10 species, it will simplify and you might only have, hi there, and you might only have 2 or 3 plants left at the end, right? Or if it's grass, maybe you only have grass. Well, simplify. But if you have 30 species, it might simplify with 25 species in the end, or 20 species. Though the more species if you have a garden with 100 species in it, it's going to end up being really stable over time. You might get 90% of those species to stabilize at the end. So a general rule I have heard is, if we're talking about that first locus or a nucleus, then probably 30 species. If you throw in 30 species, you'll probably get stability with a pretty high number of species left over in the end.
And I want to comment on it. I think that's great, especially for corroboration and peer review, Mike, because I would like to reference in any papers that you got, studies that you got, I would love to see if you could share them with me. But I'll share one with you, and that's the James Dyer. He did a paper based on Emma Lucy Braun's deciduous forests of the eastern United States, and where he took the forest regions that Lucy Braun had kind of delineated or organized and documented, and then but what he did that was so great that I'm not sure if Lucy Braun did in such detail is he put out a simplified PDF, and it basically showed all of the different forest regions, and he evolved it a bit, so he changed it a bit from what Emma Lucy Braun had, and but basically he outlined the forest layers and the diversity within that. And when I counted them out, they, averaged about that, but between 28 and 30 something. And then I also remember a book on prairies, and I forget the guy who was doing the study of prairies, but it was a nice little kind of like older hipster book, coffee table book, but it was very scientifically based. And his studies on prairies was that the minimum biodiversity in a prairie ecosystem generally was about 20 species. So thank you for that. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, and moving up from there in high diversity, like forest systems, it's often at like 100 species per acre. You know, so if you're talking about a big system, like 20 plants in a guild or in a community, an ecosystem, you probably have like 100. In the tropics, it might be as high as 300 per acre. In high diversity systems in the US, it can be that high too. So yeah, thank you for that discussion. Love it.
And let me just add to that. That book, or the James Dyer study, was just dealing with trees, plants, and I think like trees, shrubs, and like ground covers. It wasn't dealing with animal diversity and things of that nature. So
Yeah, another verification of that, or maybe someone can remember off the top of their heads the name of the study in Germany on pasture polyculture, on polyculture for forage systems. There was a study there, and actually this has been replicated in Michigan now too. MSU has a study on this too, where they were comparing plots just using polyculture to plots that were being fertilized or had nitrogen fixers, and they found once they got up around 30 species again, these systems were producing fertility. They were producing nitrogen without fertilizer, in fact, and carbon. So the gardens that just had like 30 species in them, in polycultures, intermixed species, produced more soil carbon and soil nitrogen than gardens that were having compost added to them. Think about that. Ecosystems can generate fertility and productivity by themselves if we're loading up diversity in that way. So huge tool there. I want to get back and just finish up my talking so that other people can talk more. We can have a bit more discussion here. My last thing tonight is you add up all of these tools we've talked about together tonight as ways of catching and storing energy into a system, and you have a forest garden or an ecosystem. And here again is my hero, Colette. And I just like to point out how beautiful and great her garden is here. And she manages 3 acres this way by herself. She's done almost all of the work and all of the maintenance by herself. Now imagine that, one woman working alone after retirement age, tending 3 acres of annual garden. You think that's possible? That's only possible if we find ways to make nature do the work for us. We can translate that to everything that we do. Think about that. If we can take our energy and invest it in healthy, vibrant ecosystems and vibrant communities and in homes that are beautiful and maintain themselves, then we can really regenerate our societies in a way. And we can change the whole paradigm that we have as like a modern nation, so that if we get this right and we create cascades of ever-growing abundance and fertility and beauty in our communities, then we don't have to twist people's arms to create change. People will line up for it like it's the new iPhone. So with that said, I do have one last little design exercise we're kind of going to do together as a group. But before we do that, I want to spend these last 10 minutes, and we can just do this informally after kind of after class. But these last 10 minutes here, if anyone has any comments or questions or things they want to bring into this discussion on an introduction to permaculture, please do.
All right, I'll start things off.
Please.
So when we got to the end of this year was the first year I put in a garden, started with annuals basically. Aside from like a couple years ago, I put in some raspberry plants, which are doing well. And so when we started to have frosts and stuff, I was kind of not really doing anything in the garden. But just the other day, I was, tidying up stuff that had been left out and realized that, my kale and my collards were still growing. In fact, the collards look like these really weird trees, like 10 or so inches out of the ground, this huge stalk, and then a bunch of leaves. And so as I'm listening to you and thinking about growing good soil and stuff like that, I'm wondering what is best for that soil, to just let it continue to grow and see what happens in the spring, or especially since winters in Southwest Michigan are getting so mild now, or chop it up and let it fall where it is and help the soil in that way.
I was a little bit distracted looking at the chat, and I apologize. As I understood what you said, that what's in the garden now, you mentioned those tree collards. You mentioned that are coming on. They could very well overwinter in Michigan, especially if we have a mild winter. I might leave them and see what happens. They might come back. They might even perennialize. So if you like them and they were good, you could leave them. Any other plants that are dead or have died of frost, I usually do what Colette O'Neill does, and she calls it putting the garden to sleep, putting the garden to bed. Yep, chops up those things just with a little hand sickle, and put it right on top of the garden, or with a little machete or something like that. And I like to throw lawn trimmings on there too. Leaves, your fall leaves, get those on there. Get a nice deep layer of mulch onto that garden. Leave anything that can perennialize. Your brassicas might come back. Then you'll have a garden that's ready to go in spring. You won't have to till or dig or do anything. You can just plant your plants right into that if you get it right. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in fact, I have a lot of leaves because this is my second year now of not raking up all my leaves. So I could just kind of take them from other parts of the lawn and rake them onto the garden and just call it good for now. See what happens in the spring.
You absolutely could. If you're getting areas of grass encroachment, the only weed I worry about is grass. If you're getting areas of grass encroachment, you can take a pizza box or some kind of a box and put that down over top of the grass, then cover that up with your chopping, with your material. Does that make sense? So but you also get a barrier. We call that spot mulching. Any places where I'm getting grass encroachment, I'll hit those with boxes and paper bags and put the mulch on top of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I wanted to answer the can we get nature to work for us question.
Great.
Now we have 20 acres here, and the best or the most successful thing that we've grown is grass and clover and a bunch of different diversity of grasses. And we can't eat grass, but we're going to use it to fix our soil, and we're going to try to eat it by using cows. So what we did was we hired cows to inoculate the soil with microbes, fertilize it, and because a ruminant's a walking biotank, and then their split hooves make a perfect little dish to hold the seed and catch the water so that the seeds can sprout. And they also were mob grazing, so that timing is a big key, because we can't just throw the cows out there and have them overgraze. So we are doing mob grazing so that they trample everything, or trample 50% and eat 50%. And we're trying to fast forward the growth of our microbial life in topsoil, because we only have a couple inches now, but we're trying to get the thick chocolate cake. And the other thing is, in Hardin, we live in best of both worlds. We have 110 in the summer and minus 20 in the winter. And so when there's nothing alive in the wintertime, minus 20 kills most things. So the only thing that's alive is the microbes in the cow's stomach. So it carries that life in a spot where it can live throughout the winter. And then in springtime, cows re-inoculate it and jumpstart everything. ready to go. So I think that cows are one of the best thing that we're using to work for us.
Yeah, imagine if you had to do all that work that the cow's doing yourself. It's true, and that, you know, for the for an my introduction session, I tend to focus on things that things like, you know, that everybody has a garden, so I tend to focus on that, and hopefully there's so much great stuff happening in regenerative agriculture and permaculture with integrated animal systems too. So thanks for bringing in that aspect that I had left out. Very important work.
Mike, Peter in Fenville again. The cows on the large scale, but rabbits on a small scale. I've seen people in urban environments with raised bed gardens with rabbit tractors, cages that fit the top of their raised bed. So when the garden was done, they put the rabbits on it. They cleaned it out, fertilized it, they moved the rabbits on, plant behind them. You can make these systems work at a remarkably small scale if you just scale the animal life that you're working with too.
Yeah, I worked on with a project in Ann Arbor, or kind of closer to Detroit, and it was just a tiny little urban lot, and so, but it was fenced in, and all they had to do was run one fence right down the middle, and they had instant victory garden with chickens on one side and the vegetable garden on the other, and they just switched them every year. And it's a really super simple annual garden system.
That reminds me of a completely off to one side tangent. Mollison and chickens in greenhouses. He talks in the book about how you can keep a greenhouse heated with chickens. Then he came up to Kentucky in the US one time, and they showed him a greenhouse in Kentucky where they were growing mangoes, tropical fruit. 500 chickens were the heat source.
Yep, there's something. It's a little bit like the Matrix. heat from bodies. Yep, we're all little thermodynamic heaters running around on legs.
Hey, Peter, which farm was that? Or which, what was that location?
The greenhouse?
Yeah, with the mango trees.
That was somewhere in Kentucky. I don't remember a specific name or location.
Okay, yeah, because I've heard a lot of people, they've criticized Bill for, you know, that design, saying it didn't work, but you know, nice to know that somebody was crazy enough to try it, and with a mango tree at that. How many chickens was it?
500.
So 500 chickens for one mango tree, right?
No, it wasn't one mango tree.
How many
It was
mangoes was it?
I don't know how many, but it was a greenhouse where they were growing mangoes that was
Right.
heated by 500 chickens.
Right, I got that. So it was a greenhouse, but there was at least one mango tree and 500 chickens. May have been more than one mango tree, right?
Right. Yep.
Got it. Yeah. 2-story greenhouse, of course.
Not that I know of. It may have been
Okay.
divided in half, but
Okay.
yeah.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Bill Molson seemed to find all the weird stuff that people were doing in agriculture at the time. Everybody was pressing those same things, and the Global Gardener videos were amazing. And yeah, some of his papers that he did, yeah, great stuff. Well, anyone else have thoughts or questions? Want to answer one of the other questions that we had up earlier?
Could you tell us where that garden? You said it was closer to Detroit. Where was that one? That's right in my area.
Yes, that is let's see if she's on here. No, it was nope, it looks like I do not. I'm sorry, I thought somebody who was on here would know the answer to that. Yeah. No, where are you located?
I'm in Westland.
Okay. Yeah. If you get involved with, if you're on the like Transformative Adventures group, I know that there are some more people. Oh, no. Okay. Well, join
I
it.
just learned about it.
Okay, great. There are some more people in there who are over in doing stuff in the Detroit area. Is Melissa's iPhone Missa? Who is that? She might know. Well, sorry.
Thank you.
But yeah, get involved in that group, and there are definitely people involved in this group who could help you with that more, and who we connect.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah.
I just want to, I just did some calculations, thanks to, I think it was Peter, is his name?
Yeah.
Wonderful information. When I was in my PDC with Bill, I'd asked him, how, was there any way, because I like mangoes, and I was like, is there any way I can grow mangoes in Chicago? And he said, yes, if you got a 2-story greenhouse. So that's why I said that, because I assume that's, but I guess Kentucky and Chicago aren't quite the same in terms of climate zone. But I just did the numbers. One chicken puts out an average of, I guess, 8 BTUs per hour. So if you got 500 chickens, that's about 4,000 BTUs per hour. Now, I'm not sure what that equals in terms of temperature. Obviously, depends on the size of the greenhouse. But, I appreciate that a lot, Peter, because, I don't see too many people, I don't see anybody in the permaculture community really crunching these type of numbers that would allow us to grow, mangoes. So I just think that's pretty awesome, pretty awesome. 4,000 BTUs per hour, 500 chickens.
I love what you just did there, because that's real design to me, is that we really can look at the energy inputs and outputs of things like this in a sophisticated way. And we can do the same thing with resources like nitrogen. And yeah, we can solve a lot of interesting problems if we sit down and do the design. So thank you for bringing that perspective in, Matthew. Well, it's 8:06. I want to go about 2 hours in this intro session. I always hang out and wait a little bit longer to chat. So if anyone else has any thoughts or questions, or Noah, please.
My opinion.
Oh, wait. 1 second first. What I would like to do first, before you, is finish my statement there and say, because we're going to finish up, if you go over into the Transformative Adventures group, if you would like to give a donation for this meeting tonight, I have a little widget up in that forum. You can click through to give a donation if you want. That will go to support the emergence of Transformative Adventures nonprofit organization and cooperative. So that's something that I'm working on now. So any contribution you make will go towards that. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope that you heard something new and interesting that you could put to use in your garden, and or something that has inspired you. So that was my goal tonight, was to inspire you, give you a few things that you could use. Make sure you check out the documents in the folder, and thank you so much for joining. And then, like I said, I'm going to stay and hang out. We'll chat a bit more. I just want to say bye to everyone in case people start leaving. All right. So, ciao if you're taking off, and otherwise, now Noah can go ahead and continue.
In my opinion, the social aspects of permaculture are what we need to work on a lot. The technical aspects of how to create a permaculture garden, a permaculture house, we have a lot of skills built up in that area. The social aspects, as Americans, we're socially underdeveloped. Our ability to collaborate. For example, I live in a fairly affluent area where everybody is focused strictly on their lawns. I'm a member of a government advisory environmental council, and their focus right now is the issue of banning leaf blowers. Instead of converting the leaves into an asset, they're talking of converting gas blowers to electric blowers and increasing the cost to the landscaping industry. And they're blowing leaves into natural park areas. The other aspect that we don't speak about enough is the amount of hunger in the United States is tremendous right now because of the difficult economic situations. There's huge lines at food banks. If we had permaculturists working with food banks, maybe we could collaborate with them and get those people online in food banks to help them to produce some food somewhere in community gardens, or taking the gigantic waste streams in suburbs and cities and convert it into container gardens or rooftop gardens, or convert park areas to food growing. But the inertia of this, a lot of our social setups is blocking a lot of change. It's not the lack of ability to grow things ecologically or build things ecologically, it's the social setups.
Yeah. You know, I would love to talk about that myself a little, but I'd like to instead ask a leading question. How do we catch and store energy to focus on answering or addressing the problem that Noah just brought up? Are there ways we can catch and store energy on that? Does that principle apply to what Noah was just talking about?
I'm not sure if I'm off base here or not, but I'd like to share a little experience about that. Like you were talking about the guy cutting the curbs out in Tucson or wherever it was, and the city didn't want him to do it, right, until he did it anyways. And now the city actually hired him to help design the rest of the city, because the benefit that they saw from it was their sewer or their drainage systems were overloaded with runoff. And so they cut their runoff to a lot less by doing what he already did against their will, so to speak. And so what I'm saying is, to tie those two things together is somebody has to see a benefit from it. And something besides just, oh, the bees are nice and the flowers look cute. I mean, there's got to be to get some skin in the game, there's got to be an actual benefit from it. And another example that I have is, a friend of mine, this Mexican guy that lives by us, he had to move because the place he was renting, the owner died and the kids didn't want him to live there anymore. And he had these goats. And I've got a roping arena that nobody was roping in. And I said, well, you can just put your goats in my arena, until you get it figured out. Well, that was like 5 years ago. And we might never rope in this arena ever again. It might be a goat farm for the rest of our lives. And so how he pays his rent for having a space to keep his goats is he has a taco truck and he keeps us full of tamales. And so social capital is storing energy in a lot of ways through, besides we get tamales, we get huge piles of compost from these goats, and we have connections with a whole nother community. When I need help butchering a cow, I call those guys, and about 10 Mexicans show up, and it's a lot less work for me to butcher a cow. I give them some of the meat. When it's time to butcher goats, we all show up and everybody shares. But my point is there's got to be benefit from it in order for us to cooperate.
And I would love to hear what Sarah has to say too. But that's, exactly my thinking too, is that one, we have to be smart about how we're building social networks. Well, I guess I got these backwards. First, we catch and store energy into social networks. And as we do that, we slowly catch and store energy in relationships, that's social capital, and that eventually turns into political capital, right? But it only really turns into political capital if we're smart about how we do it. We have to design relationships that are truly mutually beneficial. As you were just saying, people have to get a benefit out of it. My rule for myself is I never ask anyone to give me anything, to donate to me, or to volunteer for me. I always look for opportunities for other people instead. Like I look for ways people can get regenerative assets from me and ways people can actually profit by their interactions with me. My thinking is every time someone interacts with me, I want to make them wealthier. That way they're going to come back to me again and again and again, because they know if I'm doing something, they're going to be better off if they do. So that's how I'm always investing in people. If we get that right, we make things valuable for people. We're not just getting together in random social networks. We're building something really strong over time. That turns into political capital. Eventually, we're going to be able to affect bigger systems if we do that well. So yeah, it's all about catching and storing energy still. And Sarah, I saw you mention the word social permaculture. Bye, Amy. Nice to meet you. Please do get involved in that Transformative Adventures group. It would be. Bye. And Sarah, you had comments on social permaculture? I can read them if you don't want to.
I can read it.
Sure.
From my experience, I think that reoccurring events really help people to reduce their cognitive load, because it can be kind of stressful to be like, oh, next month I have that one thing that happens once a year, and to just have your brain think about that, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of work. But if it's every week, you just in your head know, oh, I can't come this Friday night because I have an event. That kind of thing makes it easier. And then the friendships people make by showing up regularly, it's just a human thing. They exchange information and whatever else people need, and it's effortless.
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful comment. And so in permaculture, Bill Molson gave us some very particular ways of going about organizing. And, one that I'm working on right now is trying to form this Transformative Adventures thing and group. And so we are going to set up at least monthly meetings for that. And then the Permaculture Design Certificate course we're doing over the next few months is going to be meeting Mondays and Wednesday nights. Some of those are going to be available for everyone to come to. I'm going to try to make some of those just available, and others will be paid events but open, and some will just be for the PDC group. But yes, I would like to have that more regular level of contact. And moving forward, starting in January, we're going to try to do at least one transformative adventures, just meeting, strategic meeting updates, and discussion, probably once a month. So I hope you'll want to be involved in those, Sarah. And that is something that's going to be developing as a cooperative and a nonprofit. So there's some complexity to the structure I'm looking at, or we're looking at, but hopefully I will love to have a lot of opportunity for people to take leadership and be involved in that.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment on Noah's comment, because I think I have a solution that Bill would endorse. And the solution, well, the problem is the solution, and you know, the problem is the leaves, and you know, the solution is the leaf hoarders. I'm sure everybody knows at least one leaf hoarder, and a lot of you guys probably are leaf hoarders, and that's not really a bad thing, except for the fact that you hoard leaves. And leaves are a valuable resource, obviously, as Noah said, and leaf blowers are a horrible thing. I mean, it's probably the stupidest hand tool ever created in the history of humanity. All the leaf hoarders are coming. A leaf thief. Oh shit. Yeah. Well, all leaf hoarders are leaf thieves, Dennis. That's yeah. But so what I think the solution is organization. I mean, it's probably a lot easier to organize leaf hoarders than it is hippies. So there is some hope. So I think what you got to do is create a Leaf Hoarders Anonymous. And as I forget, it's Sarah, she said, got to meet every week, and you get the leaf hoarders to admit that they're leaf hoarders, which shouldn't be too difficult, and then get them to, come and meet, and maybe you just give them a space to talk about, why they hoard leaves and why they love leaves, and and then you identify. There's got to, hopefully you'll have one anarchist leaf hoarder in the bunch who, and then you invest in that one anarchist leaf hoarder to become a community organizer, or a leaf hoarder organizer. Okay, not a community. Organize the leaf hoarding community. And then you go throughout the community and you identify some hipster designers, and you identify some of the DIY builders. You go down to, you go on Amazon, get the best leaf mulcher and anarchleaf. Anarchleaf. You get the best leaf mulching machine you can, and it's not going to be good enough because I've already researched them all, and there's really no really great leaf mulching machine. But I think the best one might be the Works, WRX, where you just put the leaves in it and it will mulch. I think that's the best one out there. And hopefully the DIYers, the local DIYers and the local hipster designers can improve upon that design. And then, the leaf hoarders can go around stealing everybody's leaves. And, you may have to work hard to get to get the leaves from the leaf hoarders. But once you do, you can put it through the leaf mulching machine and process it, and then you can give some back to them. But then you start, you find the landscapers and you start selling them the wonderful mulch, and now everybody can, everybody lives happily ever after, and then there's no need for leaf blowers. Obviously, that's the goal. So that was just my thought. That might be one approach, but obviously it requires cooperation, which is, as I think Noah was saying, is the challenge. So it sounds good in theory, but in practice it's going to be a whole nother.
Yeah, that was a wonderful, very Mullisonian kind of approach there to the problem. Yeah. Anyone else have thoughts, comments, interesting things to bring up here? Anything we left out of this introduction to permaculture discussion? We get a lot of good stuff in here.
I was just curious about one thing.
Sure.
We were in the Pacific Northwest, and so we have lots of deciduous leaves, of course. And I was going over to an elderly couple's house and raking up all their leaves for them. And I put them in the back of my truck and brought them to the farm. And when I was talking with the elderly couple, they were kind of thinking that maybe they'd like to garden, but anytime they've tried gardening, things weren't working out. And I asked them where their garden was, and it was in this, pristine area that had no leaves at all, and their soil was real sandy like mine. And I was just thinking, like, why am I raking up these leaves? You could just leave them there, or move your garden to where the leaves are. Don't even run them through a machine. And come, springtime, you've got a great low maintenance that even an elderly couple could run garden. And what if everyone in a small area is doing that with their leaves come fall time? I don't think that'll take too long to organize with your neighborhood.
Yeah. Yep. I don't have to add anything to that, other than if anyone missed Allison's comment. They're called leaves because that's what you're supposed to do with them.
Since we're on the topic of leaves, my neighbor one day when I was out puttering around in the backyard said something about how he wished his yard looked as good as mine. And I was trying to make him feel better and just talking about, well, different trees contribute different, pH and whatever, and blah, blah, blah. I was just like rambling. But as I was talking, I realized that he faithfully rakes up all his leaves. Well, they use a leaf blower, and it's a very kind of a lot of inputs into their yard. I mow as minimally as possible, and they have a nice manicured yard with, I'm sure, fertilizer and stuff. And so as I was talking, I was kind of thinking, or it could be just that I don't rake up all the leaves. And the other day, my friend pointed out that you could see in their yard with this little bit of snow that we had and rain and wet stuff, that they had patches where like the water was just sitting there and that was like forming ice. And then you looked at my lawn and there's just all these leaves, like this carpet of protection on my lawn. I was like, oh yeah, like literally before my eyes, I can start to see like the different approaches to lawns and how that kind of translates over time and stuff like that. So
Yeah, wow. A really profound thing is looking at landscape engineers and their research on water infiltration into landscape types. When you're talking about forest, for example, almost 100% of water that falls onto a forest will get caught and soaked into the earth. A forest will catch and store almost 100% of the water that falls on it. Once we get down to a mown lawn is almost as bad at catching water as concrete. In a lot of cases, the water infiltration rate onto lawns is nearly zero. It's why people are out there watering them in the rain. Because it's really, really low. It can be, sub 10%. So once you even just start mowing less, getting a little more biodiversity, letting some dandelions grow, leaves, having some mulch and that down on the lawn really starts to get water into the soil again. Bye, Linda. Thanks for joining us. it's just amazing how just a little bit of letting nature go has all these ecosystem benefits. And also, Sarah, yeah, thanks for mentioning companion plants. Yeah, in a lot of cases, it's really great to just think of adding biodiversity can be really helpful. A permaculture perspective, check out that page I gave you on guilds instead. You know, that can really take that idea to the next, Noah. It can really take that idea of companion planting to the next level for you. But even just throwing in a lot of biodiversity, mixing things up, can have a huge impact on agricultural productivity and on the health of the garden. So, yeah, it's amazing. We don't think of like ecosystems and our lawns as water catching devices either. If you want to look at this whole permaculture thing as a big solution to things, look at the problems we have today. Biodiversity going down, ocean dead zones growing, aquifers being depleting, people going hungry, climate change. Your lawn, what we do in our yards is a leverage point for all of those at once. Bye, Shane. Thanks. Yes, you too. Thanks for joining us. I'm honored that you joined us.
Lawns are such a nexus on so many levels. It's one of the worst uses of herbicides, pesticides of all kinds. The domestic use is obscene. When you're mowing that lawn, it's amazing how little it takes to compact soil. But if you're walking back and forth over it every day, one day a week, you know, bang, 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 you're pounding it down. And yeah, it turns into concrete. That gets you into another thing about trying to do rain barrels and that sort of stuff. That rain barrel is going to overflow. It's,
yeah,
you know, a 55-gallon drum does not hold the watershed of your roof. You'd have to have a pretty tiny house. When it overflows, where's it going? And so the rain barrel is just an interim step into your rain garden, because if you didn't design around that barrel for the overflow, then you're just creating another problem for yourself, because when that water overflows, now out of the barrel, it's stuck by the foundation of your house, and there's nothing good that comes with that. So, you know.
Yeah.
But if you're running it out onto the hard lawn, then you might as well just put it on your driveway.
Yeah. Yeah, I always say water collection is great, but only if we're using it for water direction. Water direction is better than water collection usually, because yeah, even if you got like 1,000-gallon cistern system, it tends to be empty when you need it and overflow, and you know, it can be problematic to set it up every season. I mean, it's not bad, and it's good to do too if you have the resources to do it. It's great, but getting water into the soil can often be just more effective.
Well, and that's
as Bill said.
Yeah, those systems are just one of those places where you should do the math.
Yes.
You know, is that 5,000-gallon cistern going to water your garden for a week when you need it? You can calculate that and figure it out. And you know, when you need it, it's likely to be more than a week of drought. So, you know, is your system going to hold enough water to get you through the drought? And how big does that need to be? And now maybe we're not talking about a cistern so much as we should be talking about maybe building an in-ground pond. And I don't mean an open surfaced one. There's some examples out there of subterranean, man-made, organized, structured water storage that hold tens of thousands of gallons and actually will get you through a drought.
Yeah, our main intensive beds are subsurface ponds too. They're wicking worm bed systems. And, that's not our whole garden, but our main intensive beds are. And that might be another reason why they require so little water, And that's where we grow the crops that require a lot of water. In the Transformative Adventures group, there was actually a little thread where these wicking worm bed designs came up. And it's a lot of work to do that. But I'm thinking like one of my beds there probably holds like 7 or 8 rain barrels worth of water in one bed. So it's pretty good as a water storage system.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
And also I just wanted to add one of the probably, it'll be some work, but obviously permaculture takes some work, especially in the beginning. But if you weren't going to do anything, or you're only going to do one thing, perhaps getting a broad fork and just broad forking your compacted lawn would would actually increase your groundwater storage just by aerating the lawn and allowing the water to go somewhere. And you could do that over just do a little bit every day. And after a year of doing that, if you divided, let's say you divided your lawn up into 180 quadrants, so to speak, to just kind of that would tell you how much you needed to do every day in order to do it for half the year, because especially if you're in a temperate environment, 6 months out of the year you're not trying to necessarily do that. And another thing I wanted to suggest is that the Leaf Hoarders Anonymous Association would probably be relatively easy, but maybe a more important organization might be the Leaf Blowers Anonymous Association, because those are the guys that really need help and need to admit that they got a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing, what we talk a lot about in my class, in the landscape transformation program classes, is people feeling ecosystem guilt, like they're not able to regenerate or do enough, and they feel a real obligation to regenerate the ecosystem. And a lot of times, and Matthew's suggestion is great. If you got time to do that one thing, you can, and you got plow pan, you can break it up with a broad fork. It's a great tool. But looking at those studies, and I'm not sure, I think these may have been done after Bill Mollison's main research time. But the research that landscape architects and the numbers they use and some of the research now on water infiltration rates have found that as you move from mown lawn, which can have just like abysmal, like 2% water infiltration rates over a lot of storms, because they have to get wet before they can soak any water in, and it takes them a long time to get wet because the water just rolls off. As soon as you move to meadow, you get up to like 30-50% water infiltration rate. So if we could just get people to stop mowing their stupid lawns, we increase water infiltration rate immediately. So a lot of times, one of the best things you can do to regenerate the landscape is nothing. Nothing is better than mowing. If you're mowing the whole lawn, the best thing you can do is just stop that. Your system will immediately start increasing in biodiversity, increasing in soil nitrogen, increasing in soil carbon, increasing in water infiltration, everything, just if you stop mowing.
So for me,
With that these days is that then the township comes around, depending on where you are, and cites you for having let your noxious weeds go nuts.
That's right, and that's why we have that Transformative Adventures Landscape Initiative thing that we're working on. That's going to be coming this spring. We're going to get signs out. We're going to have a crowdsourcing campaign for it. We have an artist who's going to be doing the sign for us, who's brilliant, and we'll get landscape signs out for people to show that they're not just they don't just have blight. they have a regeneration project, and we're going to give people support on how to make that aesthetic too. But yeah, we're working on that thing thanks to these kinds of discussions. It's discussions just like this that have led to some of those ideas that we're working on together. Cameron, I think, asked about native biodiversity. I want to talk about that really quick. What is the role when we're talking about biodiversity for native biodiversity? And one of the rules that I have seen attributed to Bill Molson, I looked for this in the designer's manual and couldn't find it. But Toby Hemingway, I think, uses it in Gaia's Garden, and some other permaculture authors have used it, is kind of a decision matrix for when to choose what plants. Bye, Denise. Or are you leaving? Or I'll catch you in a minute. Okay, not yet. So is what to choose when, what plant to choose when. And the rule was always choose a native plant first, if you can, if it solves your problem, you know. So if you can find a native, if you need a nitrogen fixer, choose a native one first if you can. If you don't have a native option that will accomplish your goal, then choose, you know, an exotic plant that's proven to be safe, to be good, a naturalized plant. If there are none of those that will suit your need, then next choose plant, you know, experimental plants, but only under the conditions where you're doing it as an experiment and you're making sure it's going to be safe. You know, you're not just planting it anywhere. And then finally, don't plant plants that you know are going to be invasive, or do it on only under very controlled circumstances. You know, Bill Molson hardly ever gave hard rules about anything. You know, so I don't think he ever said don't plant those, but I think he did say plant them with care. I know he himself got in trouble on a couple cases for planting plants that ended up being invasive where he was planting them. So another rule that he gave was don't mess in the bush, and that one we did find in the designer's manual, and that means value and keep the integrity of native ecosystems that are healthy. So permaculturists, we're not going into ecosystems that are already healthy and planting, you know, we're trying to maintain the native integrity of healthy ecosystems. So maintaining native biodiversity is a very important part of the process. When it comes to and I'll tell you, my experience, like in Southwest Michigan and in Illinois, is that a lot of the permaculture gardens that I have seen have more native biodiversity in them than a lot of the native gardens do. In fact, I've had multiple native plant specialists and native plant landscapers visit my garden and say that they felt like it had more native plants in it than any of the native plant gardens in the city. And that's almost true. There's one guy who has more native plants than me, but my garden's a food garden, so it does multiple work at the same time. It does, you know, it stacks functions in that way. But native biodiversity and native plants should be very important as part of our stewardship work. We should be thinking always of increasing native biodiversity and regenerating native biodiversity on all of our sites. And yes, when it comes to impacts on pollinators and healthy native insect biodiversity that translates to better functioning gardens, native plants are high-powered plants we can use. A lot of our native plants are going to be the best plants for increasing the ecosystem health within our food gardens too. So I hope, Cameron, did that answer your question? You can send me a message if it didn't. I'm very passionate about that subject. A lot of my favorite plants are native plants, and I always try to advocate for them. When we talk about ecosystem services, I always have a hand in my polycultures class on native pollinators through the season. I hope everyone who's doing permaculture activism is also promoting the use of native plants in the landscapes. So, hope that answers your question. Okay.
Hey,
So,
Mike.
Yeah, Jason?
Yeah, so something that seems to have been a thread in this last 20 minutes of conversation or so is the issue of control. Like if we're talking about rain barrels, we're completely controlling the water. If we're talking about a wicking bed, we're controlling less. If we're talking about a forest, we're controlling the water even less. When we talk about a lawn to a meadow to a forest, or if we're talking about native plants versus various levels of introduced plants, there's this theme of we exert enough control to meet our needs and not more. And if we're using machines, it can be very little work to exert a massive amount of control. And if we're using hand tools, it's a lot of work to exert a lot of control. But in either case, really, the best thing we can do for the ecosystems is to exert the control that we need to meet our own needs and to feel no guilt about that. Like we've got some lawn at our house that's cut short because we need outdoor space that's easy to navigate. We have a little lawn because we don't need to control that big of a space. So for all of these things, I like to not look so much at the work because there are various shortcuts we can accidentally take or intelligently take. But if we look at control, we can get really close to finding out what's appropriate and beneficial for us to do.
Yes. Thank you. That's awesome. And Matthew.
Yeah, I just wanted to refer you guys to page 7 in chapter 1 of the designer's manual. Bill has a couple of, and I think this is probably what you were talking about, but he doesn't really talk about native so specifically. But what he does have is a couple of things that I'll just read.
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody was calling. He says at the end of one paragraph, our own survival demands that we preserve all existing species and allow them a place to live. And then he says, if we need to state a set of ethics on natural systems, let it be thus. And this is a set of ethics on natural systems. One is implacable and uncompromising opposition to further disturbance of any natural forest where most species are still in balance. Vigorous rehabilitation of degraded and damaged natural systems to stable states. Establishment of plant systems for our own use on the least, in italics, amount of land we can use for our own existence. I think that's really, really important because, people talk about permaculture, but, oftentimes there's a lot of broad scale permaculture and there's not enough garden scale permaculture. So I think this, the reoccurring theme in the designer's manual, that's why I always argue it's not about farming, it's about gardening, because it's the least amount of land and farms are not the least amount of land. And then he says establishment of plant and animal refuges for rare or threatened species. And so I always think of zone 5 as that space, right? If we're using the least amount of land to grow our food, then zone 5, we're always trying to make zone 5 bigger. And if we're, our directive is to establish refuges for rare or threatened species, that zone 5 or anywhere in our garden is going to be that. And then he says permaculture as a design system deals primarily with the third statement above, but all people who act responsibly, in fact, subscribe to the first and the second statements. That said, I believe we should use all species we can and can find use for in our own settlement designs, providing that they are not locally rampant and invasive. Whether we approve of it or not, the world about us continually changes. Some of us would want to keep everything the same. I think this is where, he's talking about native freaks and, conservationists who are trying to preserve ecosystems as if they're these static systems that don't adapt, evolve, and change. And then he says, then he has, in a world where we are losing forest species and whole ecosystems, there are 3 concurrent and parallel responses to the environment. One is care for surviving natural assemblies, or to leave the wilderness to heal itself, as you said, stay out of the bush. And that's the zone 5. Rehabilitate degraded or eroded land using complex pioneer species and long-term plant assemblies. And then he says, parentheses, trees, shrubs, and ground covers. And to me, that just means forest gardens and food forest, meaning we shouldn't just be making annual gardens. We should be creating ecosystems. And then he says, create our own complex living environment with as many species as we can save or have a need for from wherever Earth they come. And then he also says here, we are fast approaching the point where we need refuges for all global life forms, as well as regional, national, and state parks for indigenous forms of plants and animals. So that's native. While we see our local flora and fauna as quote unquote native, we may also logically see all life as native to the earth. While we try to preserve systems that are still local and diverse, we should also build new and recumbent ecologies from global resources, especially in order to to stabilize degraded land. So the reoccurring theme here is stability and restoration. So if we have a piece of land that's been destroyed, like the one that you showed in the picture, I think that was in China. Was that John Liu?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So in a situation like that, we shouldn't be thinking all native, because the weeds are going to probably fix that land a lot quicker and a lot better. And if the natural ecosystems that would be able to perhaps repair that land, if a lot of those species have already went extinct,
Yeah. Thank you for all of that. And I totally agree. If you're talking about a lawn too, a lawn has maybe a couple species of Eurasian grasses. Yeah, definitely. It has a couple of species of native grasses, or of Eurasian grasses, if you're in North America. If you plant a garden and you add, 2 or 3 native species to that, you increase the native plant species by 300%. Even if you're also growing some vegetables in that, So you're regenerating native biodiversity significantly just by making that change. And while you were talking, I wanted to bring back, you were really reminding me of this set of slides again, and just showing that idea of how we go from that first picture and end up with something that in this picture you see in the back there on the right side away from the house, you see some forest that's probably got a lot of native species in it. It's probably a nice, nicely developed ecosystem there. And it has this whole gradation going up to the house where we probably have that intensive garden with lots of species. The other thing I was really thinking is Bill Mollison was so ahead of his time. Modern ecology and restoration ecology is just really starting to get some of those points that Matthew just read. Now, I mean, now cutting edge ecology today is where Bill Mollison was at 30 years ago. Yeah. Yep. Bye, Sarah. Bye, everyone. Thank you for everyone for hanging out this whole extra hour with me. That's great. Feel like this was a great introduction to permaculture, environmental psychology. We'll get back to that thread in the Transformative Adventures group. I'm going to fill that up with a few more resources. We're going to put a recording of this talk, this discussion in there too. And hopefully this has been a great introduction to permaculture for a bunch of people who are already basically permaculture experts. Bye, Melissa. Bye, Jason.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
You have to check yours because
Thanks, Mike. Wonderful
Bye.
introduction.
Thanks, Matthew.
Mhm.
Thank you for bringing Bill into it. Hopefully I had some Bill in there. Bye, Joseph. All right, bye everybody. I'm checking out now.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye, Denise. Thanks for joining.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Fun as ever. Have a good night, Mike.
Thanks, Peter. Bye.
Bye-bye.